Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian from the Reference Department at Beebe Library. You may have seen this program earlier this week, and I apologize because the sound quality was not very good. And so this is a redo of the same program now that I've fixed the problem. One of the difficulties of being quarantined is working with the equipment that you have in your house. And I have now resolved the problems with microphones and sound quality. So this is hopefully going to be a better way for you to enjoy this program and the other ones that I hope to do over the next couple of weeks. Since we are all stuck at home and travel is pretty much off the table for the time being, I thought you would enjoy some armchair travel instead. And WCAT, the cable TV station here in Wakefield, has generously partnered with Beebe Library to help us continue to provide our programming to you in any way that we can. And I'm pleased to have you join me today for a tour of County Devon in England. If you'd like to also do more armchair traveling, I hope you will follow me on Instagram at #the_traveling_librarian, where you'll be able to enjoy some more photography of different parts of the world. So let's get started. This is a presentation about a part of a trip that I took in the fall of 2019, where we visited various sets of friends in southwestern England, in Oxfordshire, Somerset, and also Cornwall. I hope you will be able to enjoy me in the coming weeks to tour those areas as well, because I will be doing 2 additional programs covering Cornwall and also Oxfordshire and Somerset. So for comparison, Devon, which we'll be looking at today, is the 4th largest county in England. It is about 1.2 million people, and it's about half the size of Connecticut. Here you can see an outline of Massachusetts over southwestern England, just to give you an idea of comparison. Devon itself is a very large county geographically. The capital is Exeter, which we will visit, and it is the landscape is mostly moorland and upland, a good amount of forest, and some beautiful coastal scenery, which we'll see on both the north and south coasts. There's a lot of good, solid English food in Devon, particularly fish and chips, which you can see on the left. That actually is a sort of gastropub version of fish and chips, so it's a little more elegant than you might get in a regular fish and chip shop. And on the right, you'll see Devon cream tea, which is very popular and often eaten in the afternoons or almost any time of day. It's a traditional food with tea, good English tea, homemade scones, jam, which is usually some kind of fruit jam, often strawberry, and clotted cream, which you can see in the little container in the upper right. The interesting thing about cream teas is that Devon and Cornwall, both of which do them, they're very popular in both counties. In Devon, it's very important that after you split your scone, you put the cream on first, and then the jam on top of that. As soon as you cross the border into Cornwall, you'll find it's exactly the opposite. They put the jam on first and then the cream on top. They're pretty lenient with tourists, so you don't have to worry about whether you do it right or wrong. And it's delicious either way. We're going to start in Exeter, which, as I mentioned, is the capital or county seat of Devon. It has about 130,000 people, and it's a beautiful base for visiting the area. It has a nice waterfront because it is on the Exe River. It's not actually down on the English Channel. It's up a little bit, but the river is very wide at that point, and they've redone the entire riverfront. It's a good size for strolling around. There are a lot of very nice pedestrian areas with shops and restaurants, lots of half-timbered medieval buildings, many of which have been modernized to new uses, like this one, which is now an Urban Outfitters. But the highlight of the city is actually Exeter Cathedral. Here you can see the west front. The current building goes back to about the year 1400. The cloisters, which used to be extensive, were destroyed during the English Civil War, so those no longer exist. There was also, on this side of the building, a side chapel that was destroyed during World War II during an air raid in 1942. There's a lot of ongoing restoration projects in the cathedral. They even, on the interior, had a Lego model. This model you can see on the right is entirely made out of Legos. And as donations come in, they are gradually building a model of the cathedral, which is quite elaborate. It's known for having the longest continuously vaulted ceiling in England, which is the result of it having a kind of unusual design. There is no center tower at the transept, the crossing in the cathedral, which would have broken a traditional cathedral design before you get from in between the nave and the choir. And because there isn't that design here, there's a very long, beautiful nave that is completely vaulted from one end to the other. Here's a carved minstrel's balcony from the 1360s that shows individual musicians playing medieval instruments from that time period. There are tombs of famous individuals throughout the building. Here's a view of the west window and a clearer view of that gorgeous fan vaulting. That particular type of vaulting is, it's not unique to the British Isles, but it's much more common there. You will see it more in England than you will in French or German or cathedrals elsewhere on the continent in Europe. Another thing that makes Exeter Cathedral quite beautiful is the large number of ceiling bosses. That's the term for these little medallions that are visible at the crossings of each of the vaults. There are over 400 unique ones in the building. And the one we're looking at here, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is actually depicting the murder of Thomas à Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. There are gorgeous choir stalls carved out of wood. Here's an example of one that has an unusual elephant carving on it. And they also, in Exeter Cathedral, have an absolutely gargantuan organ. You can see on the right some of the largest organ pipes. And for scale, that door over on the left is a standard size door. So most of these pipes on this wall go up to about 25 or 30 feet high. And it's also known for having really nice bells. In fact, Exeter's bells in the bell tower on the south of the cathedral are the second heaviest bells in the world, after Liverpool Cathedral, which is not too far to the north. Exeter, as I said, is not on the ocean, but it's very close to it, so you do see a number of seabirds. Here's one helping itself to a picnic. And I found this amusing as I was walking around the pedestrian streets. Here's one that tells you to beware of children, which I think is always a good idea. Moving on, we're going to head a little bit west. And as we go towards Dartmoor, which is the largest national park in Devon, we stayed in a town called Morton Hampstead, which is a small market town. There's not actually that much to do there, but it makes an ideal location on the edge of Dartmoor. And it's a good base for exploring day trips in the surrounding area. This is the bed and breakfast we stayed in over the actual post office. And it's a lovely old building. Here was the view from our room. And Morton Hampstead does have a number of really nice, comfortable local pubs and restaurants. Beyond that, there's not actually very much to do in the town other than look at the shops and stroll around what actually is just a very nice town to live in. There were a lot of locals and their dogs. English people certainly love their dogs, and they are free to take them into shops and restaurants. You'll see them all over the place. There is a nice parish church and churchyard, and there are a few art galleries that make it an interesting place to explore. We found this unusual sculpture made out of twigs on a little side street. But the pubs are great. We ended up going to this particular one several times while we were there, and you saw the same people every night. It was clearly a local hangout. And the food is also great. These are examples of good standard British fare. This is a meat pie In this case, it was a kakaliki pie, which was made of chicken and leeks, chips, steamed vegetables, and a nice thing that you can get in a lot of local pubs also is the kind of really good microbrews that are popular here in Massachusetts. So there are ales, ciders of all kinds, and it's fun to try the ones that are local because you're unlikely to find them anywhere else. And of course, full English breakfasts also are a good way to start the day with bacon, sausage, sauteed mushrooms and tomatoes, eggs any style, and all kinds of pastries. It's hard not to get a hearty breakfast in England. We're going to move on to a place that's kind of unusual and not very far from Morton Hampstead. It's right on the edge of Dartmoor, and it's known as the last castle built in England. Castle Drogo was actually constructed between 1910 and 1930, and it was designed by a very famous English architect called Edwin Lutyens, who was well known in the first half of the 20th century. It's an unusual style of being designed in a very traditional castle, medieval castle style, but with very much an early 20th century look to it. It was built by a man named Julius Drew out of local granite, and it sits on a very high granite hill with lovely views out over the Devon countryside. They're still doing restoration work on it because actually from the very day that it opened and the family first moved in, it has had water problems that have caused damage to the windows and other parts of the castle. So they're still doing an ongoing restoration of that. The interior is an unusual austere mix of both medieval and modern. This is the main hall, and the stair hall going down to the dining room, which has an absolutely fantastic window that's probably 20 or 30 feet high. And that takes you to the dining room. Many of the rooms in the castle are actually quite modestly scaled for a building of this size. Here is the library and billiard room with its massive fireplace. You can see the granite is visible everywhere in the building. You can also explore the bedroom wing. This is a bathroom. Since it was built in the 20th century, it does have a number of modern amenities like electricity and hot and cold running water and indoor plumbing and so forth. Here's the historical toilet, which they point out you should not use. I don't know if they've had problems with that in the past with tourists actually trying to use it. And you also get a chance to explore some of the servants' quarters, which is always fun because it gives you that a better understanding of the upstairs, downstairs feeling of how a big country house would have run and how many staff it took to run a house of this size. Here's part of the kitchen. You'll notice that the kitchen is actually, the sink in the kitchen is actually made entirely of wood, and that was very deliberate as a way to reduce breakage of china when they were being washed by hand. Here's a view out over the surrounding countryside and a view of the chapel and the tall tower on the back of the building. You can see it has a very unusual sort of, you can imagine this was built in the 20s or 30s. It also has beautiful gardens, both formal and informal gardens. It's now a National Trust property, and the gardens are quite well maintained. They were also designed by the architect, Edwin Lutyens. Here's a croquet court, and the little inset shows you something that may look familiar to you. Edwin Lutyens designed, when he designed his buildings, he designed furnishings, the building, the windows, the doors, absolutely everything into a coherent whole. And this outdoor garden bench became so iconic of his design style that you can still buy them everywhere today. And in fact, if you go to garden centers right here in New England, you may very well find versions of this that you can put in your own backyard, but they go back to Lutyens a century ago. And here are some fall cyclamens. Again, this was late September, and we got very lucky with the weather, so there was a lot of sun, warmth, and beautiful fall flowers. But I do want to take you into Dartmoor, which is the largest national park in Devon. It's another area of granite upland with lots of outcrops, also bog country, heathland, and moors. It's quite large. It's actually about half the size of Middlesex County here in Massachusetts. And there's quite a bit of wildlife there, both domestic animals and wildlife. You'll see a lot of sheep and cows, semi-wild ponies, as well as a lot of birds and insects as well. Here's some of the ponies that freely roam the moor. You do have to be careful driving because it's open rangeland and you will often find animals in the road. Rush hour can often look like this in Dartmoor. And they do have warning signs. Sheep do lie in the road. And in fact, this sign isn't kidding at all, because not only will you find them lying in the road, but as they stroll across it, they may quite well stop spontaneously and just sit down in the road right in front of your car. So it's particularly important to be careful when you're driving at night. The whole area is beautiful for hiking and country walks. It's because it's an upland, it is very windy, and it's not terribly forested. So there's a lot of strong wind. And it does, although it seems safe and open, you do have to be careful of the weather because it can change quite quickly. The temperature can drop, and you can find yourself getting lost in fog. This is a small area of standing stones. The area does have the remains of a number of early Neolithic settlements. And although this is nowhere near as dramatic as Stonehenge, it comes from about the same time period. So it's kind of fun to see these as you drive around. This is an old stone bridge from a tiny village called, appropriately, Two Bridges. This is one of the two bridges. It's right smack in the center of Dartmoor. And one of the main reasons to go there, in fact, probably one of the only reasons to go there, is to take a fantastic hike, more of a country walk because it's mostly level, to a place called Wistman's Wood. And that is about a mile or two from the village. You walk down this gravel farm road through beautiful heathland with livestock. We were there late in the afternoon, which is a nice time for photography because the low light really makes it quite beautiful. As you walk along this path, you'll see a number of granite outcrops like these up on the hills. These are entirely natural. These are not man-made structures. You will find these eroded granite outcrops throughout Exmoor, Dartmoor, and Bodmin Moor also. The landscape that we're heading towards is that forest that you can see in the far distance in this photo. It's an oak wood, just a small oak copse, only a few acres. And you would never know until you got there just how fantastic it is. It's an unearthly landscape. Again, late in the afternoon, the light is just spectacular. It's several acres of gnarled old oak trees. Some of them are up to 400 or 500 years old. There are moss and lichens growing all over them, and also on the many granite boulders that are underneath them. We were also lucky enough to be there with basically nobody else. So it's you could easily imagine yourself in an old fairy tale or a J.R.R. Tolkien novel. The whole area has a feeling of mythology and fantasy. You can imagine pixies or trolls hiding in the background. And then here is rush hour heading back home to Morton Hampstead as the sun goes down over the moors. The driving actually in countryside England can actually be quite hair-raising. Not so much because of driving on the left, although that can take a day or so to get used to, but more so because the roads are extremely narrow. There are a lot of very close hedgerows along the sides of the roads, They even have machines that will go up and down the roads to trim all of the foliage from the sides high enough for trucks and, like in this case, double-decker buses to be able to drive without scraping along the trees. They even, these machines even will cut a little V-shaped notch on the sides, which is right at the spot where your side mirror would be scraping the branches. So that's how close things are. There are laybys, so if you meet people coming in the opposite direction, there's maybe an entire foot or two that you can pull off to the side so that you can squeak by each other. The next place we're going to visit is Plymouth, which is, although it's not the capital, it is the largest town in Devon. And it's, in fact, more than twice the size of Exeter, with about 250,000 people. It's very much a seaside town. And it is appropriately at the mouth of the Plym. Here in Massachusetts, we have a lot of towns that end in M-O-U-T-H, but we forget that the original towns in England very often were called that because they were at the mouth of a particular river. And Plymouth is logically at the mouth of the Plym. It's also at the mouth of the even larger Tamar River, and which this bridge crosses. The Brunel Bridge that you can see in the back is one of the very many early bridges built by him. He was an important Industrial Revolution era engineer. This bridge is from 1859. That's how old it goes back. And the downtown harbor in Plymouth has been completely revitalized very nicely with shops and restaurants, museums. There's a very nice aquarium there as well. It's a great place to stroll around and look at the historic architecture. The port and harbor is guarded by this post-English Civil War royal citadel, which was built in the 17th century, and is now, you can climb up to the top and get superb views from the park over the entire harbor. Here you can see the aquarium off in the distance. And the steps right in the foreground are an important monument for us here in Boston, because these are the steps to the Mayflower Steps Memorial, which is the site where tradition says that the Mayflower settlers left from Plymouth, England, to cross the Atlantic in 1620. There's also, just around the corner, a similar memorial to the people who left from England to go settle the Roanoke colonies in the New World as well. The harbor is actually huge. It's a very nicely protected harbor with headlands on both sides. And you can stroll all the way around and eventually end up on the highest point, where there is a lighthouse called Plymouth Hoe. And we happened to get there right as they were having a graduation ceremony for a local college. There's a statue of Sir Francis Drake, who's connected to Plymouth. And in addition to the harbor areas, there's an awful lot of nice little back streets that you can explore, like this one that leads to a beautiful surprise hidden Elizabethan garden behind these traditional homes. And the main shopping street, if you follow it around the corner, leads you to the Plymouth Gin Distillery, which is a famous brand of gin even today. That goes back to 1793, but they're still producing it, and you can take tours of the distillery if you're interested. Not very far from Plymouth, in fact, just about 15-20 minutes across the river, is a gorgeous Georgian country house called Saltram House. Anytime you're touring England, you have to see at least one or two of the beautiful stately homes that are sprinkled all over the country. And it's kind of fun because they come from a variety of different eras. Some of them are medieval, some of them are much more recent. This is one that dates to the 1740s. There was originally a house here, but it was completely remodeled by the well-known Scottish architect Robert Adam. I found this statue on the right kind of amusing because it made me think it was a memorial to one of the architect's workmen. But here's a better view of the side of the house. As a Georgian home, it's very symmetrical. It's a typical classical Georgian facade. And the interior has, in addition to beautiful architecture, some very nice collections of decorative arts. And this is some of the Parker family who owned the home, had a amazing collection of paintings, including a number of portraits by Sir Joshua Reynolds. The most important room in the house is the huge double-cubed drawing room, which is considered one of Robert Adams' most famous interiors. He spent several years in the 1750s on the continent, particularly Greece and Rome, studying classical architecture, and he was one of the first people to come back to England and become a major influencer of the classical revival style, which was popular over the next 150 years. You can see the dining room on the left and a slightly brighter view of the drawing room on the right with the incredibly elaborate plaster ceilings. You may notice that some of the style of the house, particularly this door detail, is actually similar to some of what you can see here in Beebe Library in Wakefield, and that's because the architect who designed the library did make use of Adamesque classical revival details, and so the historic parts of Beebe Library do have, they owe a debt to the Adamesque style from 100 years earlier. This is another one of the homes where, in addition to the upstairs rooms, you can also see the downstairs area. And that's fun because you get to see how the house would have been run. Here in the kitchen, they have some antique bug catching devices, which would have had sugar water that would attract insects who would then die in the containers. The kitchen is huge, has an awful lot of copper to polish. And here up is the upper level of the stair hall where you can see many of the bedrooms of the family. And here's the library. And a view out from the front hall over the lawns. There's some elegant statuary, and the grounds themselves are quite extensive. Again, like many English country houses, there are both formal and informal gardens, but there's a lot of areas to explore, bridle paths where you can go horseback riding. This is an old orangery that has been turned into a tea house. Now, for a little bit of a change of pace, we're going to zip straight north and end up on the northern coast and look at a couple of towns that go together. Linton and Lynmouth are on the edge of Exmoor, which is another one of the national parks in Devon. Exmoor is about half the size of Dartmoor, but it's very similar in terms of its landscape. And the River Exe that comes out in Exeter rises in that upland area. Linton and Lynmouth are two lovely paired villages, one up high and one down low. Linton itself, the upper village, is nestled in a little dell at the top of the cliffs, and it has a lovely Victorian feel. Many of the buildings are from the 19th century resort period. Here's the town hall, an old hotel, and the high street with some really nice Victorian buildings. They even have a quaint little historical local history museum. There's a 13th century parish church that's perched up on the hill with a great view out over the cliff edges. Down below, 700 feet below, in fact, is the much smaller village of Lynmouth, which, as you might guess, is at the mouth of the Lynn. And from there are really beautiful views up and down the coast. The two villages are connected by a funicular that goes up and down the steep cliffs. I'll show you that in just a moment. The gorge that goes up the river Lynn is about 700 feet deep and has some really nice hill hiking in as you go up the river. You can see how much smaller Lynmouth is with its tiny harbor and where the river comes out. Up on the tops of the cliffs, you can see parts of Lynmouth. There are a number of beautiful bed and breakfasts and country inns that you can stay at. And there's a rocky beach. Here's a humorous photo of me. There's a museum right at the mouth of the Lynn River that talks about the power of river water that they have used for hydropower in these villages for many centuries. And here's a view of the funicular. It's an unusual contraption. It opened in 1890 and has two cars that just go up and down, back and forth, that are actually powered by gravity because they have water tanks that are filled from cisterns. And then as the water is released from the tanks on the cars, that allows the cable to send the cars up and down. If you like old industrial engineering heritage, it's a fascinating piece of equipment. There are lovely inns that you can stay in. And another thing to do in this area is to take coastal hikes. There are coastal paths that go all the way around most of the British Isles. This is a particularly nice stretch that's very popular because of the destination at the end of it. It may not be great if you don't like heights, although it's very level and very safe, but it is quite precipitous. So you get an amazing view up and down the coast. And what you head to down at the far end after about a mile or so is an area called the Valley of Rocks, which is a small valley just inland from the cliffs and parallel behind some hills. And at the end, you can climb up to those precipitous rocks that are way up at the top, where there's an amazing view both down and out. Here are some bird watchers enjoying a bench right in the middle of the moorland. The whole area around Linton and Lynmouth, again, I said this is Exmoor, and the region is absolutely gorgeous, typical British countryside. It's also the area where it's famous for being the country where the classic English novel Lorna Doone, written by Richard Blackmore, was set. In fact, in the glen in the background where you can see a sort of forested area, that's the village where the story is actually set. Not too far east from Linton is a tiny town called Porlock, which is also fun to visit. Technically, it's actually not in Devon. It's over the border in Somerset. It's very tiny, and it's known for having the most elderly population in Britain. And also for the fact that the road to get to it has an extremely steep 25% grade. If you follow the beach all the way to the end, you come to a place called Porlock Weir, which is this tiny harbor protected by a granite breakwater. You can see it was low tide while we were there. There are some lovely thatched houses. The whole, the port itself is actually quite old. It goes back about 1,000 years and is protected not only by the granite breakwater, but also by this very rocky beach. And the area around the town is now, there's some marshland as well that is popular with migrating seabirds. So it's a protected natural area. And again, not very far from that, again, we're still just over the border in Somerset, but a few miles up the road is a group of tiny little hamlets that are part of an old and quite large estate called the Honeycutt Estate, which was in its heyday about 12,000 acres. And Selworthy is probably the nicest of those little hamlets to visit. The village itself is over 1,000 years old, but most of what you see today was actually built in the 1820s as a sort of model village for the elderly people who lived on the Honeycutt Estate. And the highlight of the village is this spectacular 15th century church, which is whitewashed and very warm in the afternoon sun. And this is the churchyard right across the the lane that looks out over the rest of Exmoor. The barrel vaulted ceiling that you can see in the interior is quite striking. It's a much more simple church than some of the others we've seen. And in fact, it doesn't actually have stained glass. Most of the glass windows are clear, but particularly when the sun is shining through them, it's just like a little crystal jewel box and extremely beautiful. The balcony that you can see over the entrance porch to the church used to be used by the family, the Honeycutt family, during services. And the tower on the left is actually a century older than the rest of the church. It's one of the only churches in the area that is still continually whitewashed. Many of the other churches of its era would have been whitewashed, but are no longer. So it's nice to see that there is still one being kept up in the traditional style. The rest of the village is full of thatched houses. Again, they were all built more or less at the same time and in the same style. You could almost be in, it almost feels like an artificial stage set out of a fairy tale. And these are also lime washed like the church, although instead of being white, most of them have had tinting putting into them. So they have bright colors, usually things like pink or blue, or predominantly yellow. You can actually stay overnight in a couple of the houses, and one of them is also a very nice tea room. Heading back down again, we're crossing from one side of the coast to the other. Back down on the south coast is Dartmouth, a very stylish town at the estuary, as you might imagine, of the Dart River. The river mouth in Dartmouth is actually quite wide. Here we're looking across to the village of Kingsware on the opposite shore. Much of the town is built on reclaimed land, much like Back Bay in Boston, on areas that used to be tidal flats. It's a huge destination for boating. It is still a fishing port to some degree, but much of what you see now is pleasure craft, tourist boating, and so forth. And this is the center of Dartmouth, with a number of beautiful Georgian buildings that are very beautifully renovated, and there are lots of shops and restaurants. There's just a very nice atmosphere there. This inner harbor in particular, which is protected, has some beautiful Georgian style buildings. The town also has a summer regatta, and there's a traditional steam tourist train as well. And if you've done a lot of walking, there's no shortage of places where you can stop and get something good to eat. They do have one particularly noteworthy church to visit, which is St. Saviour's Anglican from the 14th century. It has a superb carved rood screen and painted as well, and a pulpit. These are from the 15th century and in excellent condition. There's also an unusual, remarkable wood and metal door, which dates to 1361. The number that you see on the door is actually incorrect. And it has leopards and a tree of life on it. There's a lot of glorious Victorian architecture throughout the entire town. Even on a gray day like when we were there, it's remarkably cheery. There are actually no bridges in the town of Dartmouth. The nearest bridge is about 11 miles up the river in a completely different town, but there's several car and passenger ferries that you can take to get across from one side to the other. Here's one of the passenger ferries, and also here's another car ferry. And again, moving back along the southern coast of Devon towards the east, our next stop is Torquay. which is a good-sized town, about 65,000 people, and it's the beginning of what's known as the English Riviera. Like many of the towns around here, it was once a fishing port, but in the 19th century, it kind of reinvented itself as a fashionable seaside resort. Our B&B was in a typical local house way up on a hill with a great view. There's still an active harbor. In some ways, it's kind of like Gloucester. It's a mix of being an active fishing port and a popular tourist destination. You can walk all the way around the harbor on the promenade, and you can see a lot of very elegant Georgian-style architecture that definitely has the feel of the English seaside. Agatha Christie was born in Torquay, and there are many sites around the town that are connected to her in some way. And there's actually a walking tour that you can take that explores all of them. The woman on the right, I just enjoyed her because she reminded me, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the old British comedy called Absolutely Fabulous, but this woman reminded me a lot of Patsy, one of the main characters on the show. And here is the clock tower and one of the elegant hotels down on the seaside. And a reminder of the fact that it is still an active fishing community. There's some beautiful parks to walk through, an old-fashioned casino, and a number of beautiful old buildings, all in this very typical local style. You can see there are palm trees in this photo, and that's because the Gulf Stream comes so close to Britain at this point that it does tend to keep the climate very mild even in winter, so a lot of tropical vegetation can grow. Another British comedy that you might remember is the old John Cleese show called Fawlty Towers from a number of years ago, and it was set in Torquay. And although the building that they used for the exterior shots of the show unfortunately no longer exists, but you can see an awful lot of little frumpy bed and breakfasts and country inns that remind you a lot of Fawlty Towers if you've ever seen the show. The weather changed quite dramatically while we were there, and we were walking along the boardwalk, and you can see a quite imposing storm heading in from the west. Not too far from Torquay is a little town called Ottery St. Mary's. This is a very tiny town known for its church. That was the main reason we stopped there. But it also has a famous son. In 1772, the writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge was born there. So there's a few things to see if you're interested in him. But the main attraction is the church, which for a small parish church is absolutely spectacular. It dates from 1260. And the overall design and plan is almost like a miniature version of Exeter Cathedral. It has two very stocky towers on the west front. And the overall plan of the church is very similar to Exeter. For a church that's so small, the interior is also quite elaborate. There's a lot of beautiful carvings, a lovely churchyard, and really incredibly detailed work on the interior of the church. The ceiling in particular, the fan vaulted ceiling that has painted ribs is quite impressive. You can also see another example on the right of the elaborate, very British style of fan vaulting that is in Exeter Cathedral, and also you'll see something similar to this in parts of Westminster Abbey if you've ever been there. And also some very old and very beautiful hand-carved pews for the parishioners. And to finish up, we're heading east through a couple of towns along the South Devon coast back towards Dorset. The first one that you come across is Sidmouth, which, like many of these communities, was once a fishing village that reinvented itself as a resort. And it's considered the gateway to what's known as the Jurassic Coast. If you look at the cliffs in the background, you can see why it has that kind of, why the area has that name. It's a UNESCO heritage area that stretches almost 100 miles along the coast. And the cliffs clearly show the geological strata from the many eras where you can still find fossils in different time periods as you look through the sedimentary rock along here. You can climb the hills to get great country walks up along the cliff tops, and this is a view looking back down to the town below. And a cliff right from the boardwalk in the center of town. Most of the town has a lot of beautiful, elegant Georgian buildings, again, along that seafront promenade. To get to the cliffs on the top, you have to hike a little bit out the edge of the town. There's a ford that you would normally cross when the water is low, but because of the storms the previous night, you actually couldn't do that, so the ford was closed. But you can walk up, and you walk through this elegant old forest that has almost a feel of the Wistman's Wood grove that we saw earlier. And when you emerge from the forest, there's just this spectacular view up and down the coastline. And you can see quite a ways east, even in the kind of clammy weather that we were experiencing. Back down in the town, here's a better view of the seafront promenade. There is a nice sandy beach and hotels and restaurants that front the beach. Here's a couple of examples of the Georgian style hotels. And the whole town has a lot of very nice pedestrian areas where shops and restaurants are. The next town that you'll encounter as we head east is a much tinier town, only about 1,300 people, called Beer. It is almost like a miniature Sidmouth, and it's delightful. It's actually not named for the beverage. It's from an Old English word meaning grove, and you can see the evidence of that because in the little narrow valley that Beer is located in, there's still a lot of forest, which is kind of unusual in some of these areas. The charming little town center just slowly goes down this main street until you get to the beach, which is very popular with surfers or just sitting around on the pebbles. And again, one of the fun things to do is to climb up on the cliffs and just walk along and get some superb views. You can see the whole town nestled in its tiny little valley. And you can also look inland. There's a rainbow off in the background, and you can see sheep farming. It was a great season for plentiful blackberries just ripening. And this was late in the day, so the sheep were commuting home from work. It's another one of those towns that doesn't have a whole lot to do in it. There's no major tourist sites. It's just the atmosphere is just lovely and very typically English. And from the tops of the cliffs, you can actually see the next town along, which is called Seaton Down. You can get a better view of some of the beach huts that front the beach there. And we're going to end in a town that you may recognize if you've watched any British television recently. This is called West Bay, but many people now know it as the location for the Broadchurch TV series that was very popular on British TV, with starring David Tennant, Olivia Colman, and Jodie Whittaker. Both David Tennant and Jodie Whittaker are also known for playing doctors in Doctor Who, which is another long-running British program. It's a great mystery that ran for 3 seasons, and the cliff that you can see in the background of this photo is actually the cliff where the murder that takes place and the whole mystery story takes place around is fictionally took place at the base of these cliffs. While we were there was some wild weather left over from the storms, so we could see a lot of surf. Fortunately, the harbor is well protected with strong granite breakwater, but there was a lot of high wind and some very dramatic skies. West Bay is actually technically in Dorset. So once again, I'm cheating a little bit and taking you just over the border, but it's right on the edge of Devon. There's a lot of good fish restaurants. It is still, again, a working fishing port. There are some really nice pubs and restaurants that you can hide in when you see an approaching storm come. Here's the protected harbor. And some very nice hotels and inns. It's a town that actually is more famous, again, not so much for things to do that are really touristy, but it's a great place if you're an active tourist who wants to do things like parasailing and hiking, surfboarding, fishing. There's a lot of that is based out of West Bay. The building that you can see in these photos was used, even though it's a modern apartment building right by the edge of the beach, it was used to represent the police station in the Broadchurch TV series. And here is on the inland river are some houseboats. The one on the far right is the one that was used as the home where David Tennant's investigator character lived. And we're going to end there. I want to thank you for joining me. That's it for now. I do hope that you will join me again at some point back in the library, where I do these programs monthly and also online or on WCAT for more destinations. Again, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, you can reach me at either my name, Jeff Klapes, or the _traveling_librarian, where I post travel photos from around the world. And I hope to see you soon and keep exploring. Thank you.